and get started.
Good morning. Welcome to the history of Russian Jews. And now we're in the 20th century, which to me is the most interesting period. Today we're going to talk about communist mobilization of Russian Jewry. The Russian Revolution liberated the largest Jewish community in the world at that time, around 3 million people. It also opened up the floodgates for the greatest massacre of Jews before the Second World War, during the Civil War and its aftermath between 1918 to 1921. Also during this time, Jews entered into nearly every sphere of Russian life. And during the same period, much of the singular richness of Jewish cultural life in Russia was flattened and eventually obliterated. We're going to have all these things going on in our class today. So why did the Communist Revolution create so many new opportunities for Jewish social advancement in Russia? Well, for one thing, because the old Russian leadership was either fired, deported, displaced, or killed. When you have a revolution, the members of the old elite do not stick around. They're usually disposed of, deposed, and in this case of the Russian Revolution, many of them were murdered. Modernization was the key economic aim of the Russian Revolution. And the state urgently needed people to set up and manage the new legal system, schools, businesses, factories, etc. The problem was that most of the non-Jewish proletariat was rarely up to the job. So the Jews were able to make use of the opportunities, and they were willing to take advantage of the opportunities. And it was really one of the first times, if not the first time in Russian history, that there were so many possibilities for Russian Jewry. Now let's talk a little bit about the ideological principles of the Bolshevik Revolution. First of all, one of the principles of the revolution was to advance the interests of a worldwide revolution. It was thought at that time by many of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution that the Russian Revolution was going to be merely the first in a series of world revolutions. And state by state, capitalism was going to fall in Europe. And the first country that was going to happen was Germany. Except that, as history showed us, that the revolution in Germany failed, the revolutionaries were murdered, and there was no revolution in Germany. Also, the Soviets at that time had sent the Red Army westward into Poland, and they were defeated in the Battle of Warsaw in 1920. So with the German Revolution failing and a defeat in Poland of the Red Army, it became very obvious that this was not the beginning of a massive revolution in Europe. Now, the idea of the Bolshevik Revolution was to create a new socialist man who would be above petty nationalist divisions. In order for that to happen, they had to create a new form of universalism that rejected any form of separateness and particularism. Lenin rejected the idea of Jewish nationalism. He said the idea of a Jewish nation was totally false and reactionary. So that brings up a question: was Lenin anti-Semitic? And there's little evidence that he was. In the Fourth Duma, the parliament, between 1912 and 1917, Lenin led the Bolshevik initiative to annul all restrictive measures against Jews. On the other hand, Lenin viewed all forms of Jewish nationalism and separatism as reactionary phenomena that deflect the Jewish workers away from revolutionary solidarity with their non-Jewish comrades, and from the struggle for the future revolution to overthrow all class barriers and finally solve the Jewish problem. So really, if we think about it, under Leninist nationality politics, the goal was to re-socialize the Jewish population so that it would become politically Bolshevized and sociologically Sovietized. All right, what did that actually mean? It meant that the Jews should consider themselves part of the Soviet family of nations rather than part of the worldwide Jewish community. Now, before you can create this wholly new, historically unique Jewish community, you had to do a few things. You had to destroy the old order within the Jewish community. You had to revolutionize the Jewish community. And you had to reconstruct or Bolshevize the Jews into a new Soviet order. Beginning in 1918, two organizations shared power to achieve these goals. One were the Jewish sections, and we're going to talk a lot about the Jewish sections. The second was the Commissariat for Jewish National Affairs, EVCOM. Now, let's talk a little bit first about the commissariats. EVCOM, as one of the commissariats, there were commissariats for all different nationalities in the Soviet Union. The commissariats were envisioned as a temporary administrative organ to construct national life, and of course the Jewish commissariat, Jewish life, on a proletarian socialist basis. So what do they want to do? Spread Bolshevik propaganda and Sovietize the Jewish community. Now that initiative really failed, basically because due to a lack of knowledge of Yiddish and the Russian Jewish community. And so the EVCOM, the Commissariat for Jewish National Affairs, really was short-lived. And the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, the Evsektsiya, or the Evsektsiya for short, were the main organ that transformed Russian Jewish life. They were created in 1918. Their mission was to reconstruct Jewish national life on a proletarian socialist basis. In other words, to integrate the Jews economically, socially, and politically into Soviet society. Well, how do you begin doing that in a revolutionary state? You weaken the attachments that the Jewish community had to the old structures. The Evsektsiya started by disbanding the Kehillah structures. They closed down synagogues. They halted all Zionist activities. They outlawed Hebrew. They helped halt all private enterprise. They ended many traditional Jewish occupations, and they caused a massive population shift of Russian Jews to urban locations. Now, by 1921, all political parties except the Bolsheviks were either liquidated or rendered ineffective, including in the Jewish community in Russia, the Bund. The outcome was by 1921, the Evsektsiya now had a political near monopoly on the Jewish street. As the old community began to disintegrate, the Evsektsiya was entrusted with the task of the new social mobilization of the Jewish community. As I said, they started by liquidating the local kehilos. The monies and the inventories of the local kehilos was forced by law to be turned over to the local Evsektsiya. Now, by the way, I want to emphasize that these were not Russians doing this to Jews. These were Jews doing this to Jews. The Evsektsiya, the membership of the Evsektsiya, and the leadership were all Jewish. They're all Jewish Bolsheviks. Next, the offices of all the Zionist organizations were raided and closed. Zionist leaders were arrested, questioned, and first released after having been forced to turn their records over to the Liquidation Committee. I love that name, the Liquidation Committee of the Evsektsiya. Jewish clerical, political, economic, educational, and cultural societies and organizations were ordered to cease operations. And this, by the way, included all adult education classes. So that if I had been giving this class in Russia in 1921, the name of all you folks would be registered. I would probably have been arrested and brought to the Evsektsiya office as a counter-revolutionary. And in the words of Bob Dylan, it would have been all over now, baby blue. All Hebrew schools were closed. Why? The Evsektsiya identified the Hebrew language as or with a class enemy, the bourgeoisie, and the Zionist political persuasion was considered a class enemy. So let's talk about the campaign against Hebrew in the Soviet Union. Now, according to historian Zvi Gittleman, the campaign against Hebrew was initiated by the Evsektsiya, not the Soviet government or the Communist Party. So we may ask why. So Gittleman says it was partly because of the traditional animosity of parts of the Jewish left to Zionism, and basically because Zionism was the strongest. Remember in the last class we talked about the mobilization of Jewish politics in Russia. And Zionist Party was the strongest opposition to communist ideology at that time. So how did this manifest itself? Well, Chaim Nachman Bialik and other leading Hebrew writers were constantly harassed by the Evsektsiya. So much so that the great Russian writer, not Jewish of course, Maxim Gorky, attempted to secure the permission from the government for 18 prominent Hebrew writers to leave Russia. That's how bad the harassment of Hebrew writers became. But the Evsektsiya blocked his attempt. The Cheka, remember the Cheka is the Soviet secret police. The Cheka chief finally intervened and allowed the leading lights of the Hebrew literary world to leave Russia in 1921. Jennifer, can you put up the text of the Hebraist Yaakov Nepomuchenski in his 1925 letter?
Is that something that you sent to me?
Yeah, that's starting on page 4.
Okay, hang on one second.
And if not, I'll just read it out loud. If we can get to it so you all can see it together with me.
Gotcha. Yeah, let me share that.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, are you seeing it there?
There we go. Okay, so who was Yakov? This is a great last name. Nepomniachtchi. Pardon my Russian pronunciation. He was a Hebraist, an old school Hebraist. And he was not one of the Hebrew writers who were able to leave the Soviet Union. He remained there. And in 1925, he wrote a letter in which he said, and by the way, in Gordon, he's referring to A.D. Gordon, the great Hebrew writer who got out of the Soviet Union and went to Israel and was a very important part of the Zionist cultural scene in Israel in the 1920s and 30s. I will say in Gordon's words, I am a slave to Hebrew forever. No one will be able to uproot Chumash and Rashi from my soul. I gave the best years of my life to these old writings. But here, I stop and go no further. I return the Torah to Mount Sinai, even though I know we remain naked without it. But how long can one be a tyrant over oneself? Ah, it is indeed bitter. Very poignant text, which really summarizes, and this is, remember, this is by 1925. So by 1925, the Evsektsiya basically had gotten rid of Hebrew and Hebrew culture in the Soviet Union. Next, they turned to attack the Jewish religion. Why? Because the most tenacious resistance to the revolution was from the religious community. The Evsektsiya was anti-religious and anti-clerical. Now, as part of the organization, as part of any totalitarian organization, the Evsektsiya could not tolerate any competing, dissenting, or different ideology. So how did they attack the Jewish religion? Well, first of all, they mobilized the Jewish press, which by that time was completely taken over by Jewish communists. They published a constant stream of articles and even vicious cartoons, which would have been branded anti-Semitic were it not for the fact that they were published by Jews. They conducted show trials in Jewish communities across Russia and the former Pale. Now, these were pageants in which costumed characters made charges against Judaism, and in every case, the Jewish religion was found guilty and sentenced to death. All religious organizations were required to register with the authorities and submit membership lists. Rabbis were deprived of the vote, and religious instruction for anyone under 18 was made illegal. In the years 1922 to 23, over 1,000 cheder were closed in Russia, and religious instruction went underground. But in fact, except for a few of the Hasidic communities, it really tore apart the religious community in Russia. Now, let me also add one thing. That this was an attack on the Jewish religion by Jews. Other religions were attacked in Russia, but none with the vigor and enthusiasm that the Jewish religion was attacked. And it's very interesting to look at the various Muslim communities in Russia at the time. So a natural question would be to ask, were there anti-religious movements against the Muslim community in Central Asia in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s? Yes, there were, but they were much more circumspect, much more carefully conducted, and with much less enthusiasm than they were against the Jewish community. Partly because there was still opposition to the Soviet Union, active opposition, armed active opposition in parts of Central Asia all the way into the mid-1930s. In 1924, the Communist Party, this is the Communist Party now, began a program of nativization. And what did that mean? All communist cultural and political organizations will conduct their work in the local language. Now remember, Jews did not have their own republic in the Soviet Union at the time. But the use of the Yiddish language began to be promoted. This is, of course, all communist literature and communist propaganda, but it was conducted in the Yiddish language. The result was an increase in the publication of Yiddish newspapers and books. However, because it was such blatant propaganda, Soviet Yiddish press failed to strike a large audience. At the same time, with Yiddish schools being outlawed, with Hebrew schools being outlawed, there was a growth of Yiddish schools. To give you an example, between 1923, the school year 1924, there were 366 Yiddish schools in the Soviet Union. By the school year 1929 to 1930, that 366 had grown to over 1,100. So what was the curriculum in these Yiddish schools? Well, I can tell you what the curriculum wasn't. There was no Jewish history, religions, or other subjects of Jewish content. They were all excluded. So what were these Yiddish schools? As someone quoted at the time, they were communism in content, Yiddish in form. So we're talking about two basic Soviet approaches emerging to national issues, to the nationality issues debate. One was a gradualist approach, that Soviet Jewry would become modernized in a gradual process. That was the Bukharin faction. The economic rehabilitation of Russian Jewry could be accomplished by starting with agricultural colonization instead of large-scale industrialization. And there was the Stalinist approach, that strengthening ethnic identity and promoting parochial cultures would slow the process of history. National integration would be achieved by assimilation. Now, between the gradualist approach and Stalin's maximum approach, which approach do you think won out in the Soviet Union? In other words, yes, it was the Stalinist maximalist approach. No kidding. The Evsektsiya tried to steer a middle course. That industrialization should remain the main path to socialism, but land settlement was also a legitimate path. So the question is, if Jews were supposed to settle the land, what land were they going to settle? Remember, unlike the other nationalities, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians or White Russians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Chechens, etc., 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 Jews basically did not have a land of their own. What land was available? All right, here were the contestants: Birobidzhan or Crimea. Where in the world is Birobidzhan, folks? Anybody know? In Yiddish, it's the Jene Welt. It's the other world. It's all the way in the Siberian-Chinese border. Okay. Yes, Siberia, right, exactly. Siberian-Chinese border. Crimea, people know where that is because that's been in the news the last couple of years. So let me ask you, why Crimea at the time? Because Crimea was largely unsettled and Russia wanted to settle it. It was also good land, good fertile land. And the communists thought this was going to be a good land to be settled, for farming. They weren't very interested in having the Ukrainians settle the land. It was right on the border. They wanted another nationality. But Crimea didn't win out. Birobidzhan was chosen as the area of Jewish colonization. Now, as I said, the program was not initiated by any Jewish organization. The Birobidzhan program was initiated by the Communist Party. And the reason was to develop the area militarily and politically. Here was the problem. There was no preparation for the settlement. So when the first colonists went out in 1927, they faced an overwhelming situation. There was no machinery. All machinery had to be imported from the nearest city, Baku, which was hundreds of miles away. There were no horses. If you don't have machinery to do the tilling of the land, tractors to break up the land and seed the land, what do you use? Horses. So horses had to be brought out. There were no buildings, no protection from the rains, biting insects, and by the way, this was largely swampland that had to be drained. So one thing that they had an amazing amount of were these horrible biting insects that bit the people, bit the horses, and carried diseases. By the summer, the majority of the horses that had been brought in were dead. Of the 654 settlers who had arrived that spring, 325 remained by October. Such an auspicious beginning to the Jewish settlement in Birobidzhan. Now, also in 1927, Stalin becomes the supreme leader. Now, Lenin had died earlier, but Stalin consolidated power. He became the supreme leader in the Soviet Union. What did that mean? that Stalinist totalitarianism was taking shape. That meant one very strong, unified, firmly centralized ruling party that could not abide pluralistic allegiances and competing loyalties. Up until that point, especially under Lenin, the Soviet system could tolerate multiple and divided ethnic, institutional, and even ideological loyalties. But by 1930, all competing or even autonomous tendencies were viewed as unacceptable expressions of dissent from the system. This is under Stalin. The Evsektsiya was accused of right deviation, including toleration of petite bourgeois moods. That's a great quote, isn't it? You're guilty of petite bourgeois moods. Oh, yeah, it's off with your head. As well as bourgeois motifs in literature, opposition to collectivization. They were accused of denigrating the role of the party and the state in agricultural colonization, and worst of all, of Jewish chauvinism. In 1930, the Communist Party's Central Committee dissolved the Evsektsiya. There was one party, the Communist Party. That was it. According to Yuri Slezkin's Jewish Century, by 1939, although 1.8 of the Soviet population was Jewish, now it was even less in Russia proper, but the Jews were moving by the late 1920s and most of the 1930s into the bigger cities. And there was a huge movement of Jews into Moscow and Leningrad. By 1939, according to Slezkin, Jews owned 32% of Moscow's shops, accounted for 15.5% of all Soviet citizens with a higher education, were 20% of the doctors, 31% of all the writers and journalists, 20% of all the retail branch managers, and so on. So we see two things going on. Number one, we see that the complete disruption of the traditional Jewish life in the Soviet Union was a fact and was achieved by the 1930s. And there was a whole new life and opportunity created for Russian Jews who were willing to become upwardly socially mobile, accompanied usually by a process of assimilation. During this period, hundreds of thousands of Jews abandoned their religion and tradition. 1/3 of Jewish men married non-Jewish women. Some 55% listed Russian, not Yiddish, as their native language. Less than 15% said that they were religious. Now, let me also put this 15% said that they were religious by 1939. This is compared to 47% of the non-Jewish population. Okay, so even though the communists were anti-religious and had closed many churches and mosques throughout the Soviet Union during the 1930s, less than 15% of the Jews said that they were religious compared to 47% of the non-Jewish population. In short, by 1939, many Russian Jews no longer saw themselves as Jews, but as Soviet citizens. I want to open up the mics, if Jennifer, if you will, and take questions. This is an amazing social transformation, folks. This happens over the period of a little more than a decade, in which you create a whole different Russian Jewish community in the Soviet Union. Basically an assimilated, Sovietized, non-traditional, unique Jewish community. Questions?
Aaron, hi, good morning. It's Paul Katz.
Good morning, Paul.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I have an interesting comment. About 10 or 12 years ago, we were on a Baltic cruise and we made a stop at Tallinn, Estonia.
Yeah.
And above the synagogue, they have a museum. And one of the photographs, one of the exhibitions in the museum that I thought was quite interesting was that that the Jewish community, even though it was a silent community, they would always gather for the birthday of one of their fellow Jews, just because they wanted the children and the grandchildren to also realize who was Jewish in that area, you know, just to give them a sense of connection to other former Jews.
Yeah. We're going to talk just a little bit about the Baltics a little bit later on, in coming classes. Because unfortunately, 90% of the Jews in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were murdered during the Holocaust. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. We have friends from Baku, Azerbaijan.
Yes.
Was that a popular Jewish settlement, or what was going on in that part of the Soviet Union?
Okay, well, that's a complicated question. First of all, there were two Jewish communities in Baku in Azerbaijan. Well, there was a small traditional community of Jews from Azerbaijan, thought to have settled as, that was part of the Silk Road, the trading road between the Far East and Europe. And it was thought that that was part of a very old community that rose up and settled there along the Silk Road. There was a later community that settled in Baku during the Second World War. As we'll learn in the next class, when, without going into the next class, there were perhaps a couple of 100,000 Jews from Poland that were able, when the Nazis attacked Poland, remember Poland was now an independent country, were able to leave the Soviet part. Remember, the Soviets and the Germans attacked Poland at the same time in 1939. They carved Poland into two spheres of influence. Initially, there were some Jews in the German part of conquered Poland that were able to get out and go eastward. Later on, when the Germans attacked Russia in Operation Barbarossa, they fled ahead of the Germans. And there were massive amounts of Soviet citizens that went eastward, and the Soviet government tried to resettle these people in Central Asian Soviet republics. And Baku was one of the places that was picked by the Soviet government during the early part of the Great Patriotic War, as they called it, after the Germans had, attacked Russia. And people fled before. Stalin evacuated the Soviet leadership, communist leadership, in many of the places, and it was just chaos. People fled. There was I'm blanking on a couple here. She's still alive and very active with the Holocaust Museum. Anna. Well, anyhow, they fled and they ended up in Baku.
Anna Steinberger.
Yeah, exactly. So there were two Jewish populations in Baku, an older one and ones that fled because of World War II. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have two questions. So, the Pale of Settlement still existed, but I guess
Yes.
it was part of Poland at that time? Did that
Yeah.
have to do
Yes.
with that
Part of
Battle of Warsaw?
Yeah, part of it was part of Poland, and part of it was part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Okay? So again, to tell the history of the Jews in this part of the world is very, very hard. Borders changed frequently, constantly, and in order to do it real justice, I can't do it as much justice as I would like, because that would take a 500-page history book. We're just skimming the surface.
Well, my point is that the Jews who ended up in the part that was Russia, most of them lost their religion and were thrilled to be, settled for being Soviet citizens. But a large part of that Pale of Settlement, where a lot of our ancestors' families came from and fled earlier, still were heavily traditional Jewish shtetls because it was part of Poland during
yes.
World War II. Yeah.
At the same time, in that class, I talked about that 100 in the wake of World War I, even in the Pale of Settlement, there was a major population shift in the Pale, that 100,000 Jews from the Pale of Settlement migrated after World War I to Warsaw, 80,000 to Lodz. Because of the Civil War, remember there was a terrible Civil War that we talked about in the last class over this area. It devastated the communities. There was no way to make a living. There was hardly, in some places, any community left. And yes, there was a traditional community, but compared to what it was before World War I, it was the shadow of itself.
Okay, my other question is, what happened to the Cossacks? Did the Russians just go and kill them all? I mean, did they become part of
Good
the
question.
white? I mean, because you don't hear about them
Well,
once it becomes a Soviet state.
Well, I'll give you the brief answer. That the Cossacks were one of the nationalist groups that were transferred from their traditional homeland by Stalin during World War II. And we're going to talk about this very briefly in either the next class or the class after when we talk about what the Great Patriotic War, World War II. Stalin transferred any number of nationalities, because once again, you still had the nationality question. You notice how in almost every class that we've had in this history class, we've talked about the problem of the nationalities in the Soviet Union. How do you integrate them? How do you deal with them? What do you do with them? Well, Stalin, after the tide turned and the Soviet army started pushing westward and retook areas that had been conquered and ruled by the Nazis, Stalin figured that these areas were tainted under Nazi occupation. They were tainted by people collaborating either actively or passively with the Nazis. And whoever lived in these areas, in Stalin's mind, were not to be trusted, especially nationalities. And he started shipping wholesale nationalities like the Chechens, the Tartars, the Cossacks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Shipped them from their traditional lands, send them east, either to Siberia or to new places, break them up so they wouldn't be seen as a fifth column. It's not that Stalin was paranoid, although towards the end of his life he was paranoid, and we'll talk about that in the future, about the doctor's plot. But how he handled what he considered to be troublesome nationalities, shipped them out en masse, and the Tartars were one, the Cossacks were one of the nationalities that were shipped out en masse from their traditional lands. Any other questions before we say goodbye? Once again, you've been a great audience. Thank you, and thanks for your questions and participation. A shout out to Jennifer for being our engineer and for keeping things running. And God willing, we'll see each other next week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Jennifer.
Absolutely. Have a great week.
Great week. Thank you.
Too.